My name is Randy Wallace. I'm an Associate Dean in the School of Business. And I confess that business is not my primary area of study. That's not how I got started academically. I got started academically as a theologian and then a missionary as I settled into one of the most impoverished counties in the country, and for 20 years ran a mission there seeking to transform communities. I found out within 2 years charity does not work. So I began looking for ways to make transformation in communities, and I found that business does work. So I came into business sideways, and I see business not like it's seen in most of our society as this terrible, evil thing. I see it as a means to transform the individual and to transform communities when it's done from a different perspective. Now, I was as part of the business school, we're overseen by an accreditation body called the IACBE, the International Assembly of College Business Educators. And they put out a call for papers on employability because they were interested in whether or not we can measure whether we're transferring the skills and the knowledge necessary for students to leave their programs and to be employed. And there's a lot of research that's out there on this, so they were asking for solutions. And I thought, I'd like to come at this from a little bit of a different angle. So there's a lot of criticism about MBA programs and graduate programs. And Mintzberg probably is known as one of the guys who started it all off with a book called Managers, Not MBAs. And he was basically saying we're not producing the kind of student that the market wants. Now, in business, one of the things that you do is you listen to the market, right? They were saying that business schools thought they were producing this sage type of wisdom, a technically proficient person who at any given point on the Starship Enterprise can be asked, Spock, what's the possibility of this happening? And he can tell them just like that. Now, on the new Star Trek, they have Data who does that, right? Well, they thought they were producing this. What they ended up producing was a different kind of a person. Sheldon from the Big Bang Theory, who is really technically proficient, but incredibly abrasive and totally unable to lead anyone in a situation. Now, what's interesting is this. When you look at either one of these people, when did Spock ever really lead the Starship Enterprise? He was continually conflicting with Captain Kirk, right? And Kirk would override him based upon some aspects of emotional intelligence and his understanding of the human situation. The other criticism that comes up is a different criticism, that a business only exists just to make money. So you have Gecko and the guy from The Wolf of Wall Street. I watched the first movie, but I refused to watch the second because there's material in there that I just don't want to see. My mind doesn't need that, okay? Ultimately, it kind of split into two directions. And I had a sense that most of the people who attended this conference would be focusing on the first set, which is down here, the skills set. Because research by Bloomberg and others, Bloomberg had done some research on different sectors of business, and they asked employers the question, okay, what is it you're looking for that you're not getting when people come out of business school? And they begin to list these skills. Interestingly enough, the market was saying, we assume that when you graduate from an MBA program, you are already technically proficient. That all of the hard skills are taken care of. You can analyze data. You can run regressions, okay? What they found is the soft skills were lacking, and they identified a number of those soft skills. Well, as I looked at the soft skills, I began to smile and I thought, well, the soft skills grow out of a foundation. And I think the foundation that they arise from is centered around the aspect of character. So when you see that top list, you look at the aspects of character. And this becomes even more important because with so much power, so much impact on society, the aspect of moral character is important. And it's not something that's overlooked in business. There are many studies associated with moral character. As you look at this, though, then how does it play out? Stepping in sideways into business, I had a different perspective on things. as a theologian, I really embrace the biblical concept of shalom. That's the wholeness of the person being completely developed and in harmony with God's original intentions. And I'm also a philosopher. So I'm continually studying philosophy. So I knew about the Catholic theologian Alasdair MacIntyre in his book, Whose Justice? What's Rationality? In which he argues that the 5 major world religions provide the best framework for containing a cohesive worldview. And you're even able to examine those worldviews and to compare and contrast them and determine which one is the most cohesive and efficient. Then, too, there are secular people looking at the aspect of character. So you look at Seligman with his 24 components of character that are divided into about 6 sectors. So I begin to look at both sides. On the one hand, and you see here, Be a Leader for God's Sake, Bruce Winston, Kathleen Patterson, Larry Spears, a number of people on the business side were looking at character, and they looked at character in terms of virtues. Virtues are good, but virtues exist within a particular worldview. I ended up gravitating more toward Nancy Pearcey's work, Total Truth. Having been a student of Francis Schaeffer, she was giving new perspective on how to look at worldview in a way that's compatible with the secular world's mindset. And she gave a great analogy, I thought. She said, take a look at the book of Genesis and compare Genesis chapter 1 with Genesis chapter 3. In Genesis chapter 1, God creates all the world, places humans in it, gives them a job, and says, this is good. Now, when you pause at that point, you can begin to extrapolate some concepts that are universal, related to God's original intentions for how people should live in the world. I began to use this as a framework for interpreting how faith integration can be made palatable to the general population. So I utilized something called dynamic equivalence. So when I talk about a biblical worldview, I'm not looking at it from a doctrinal, theological perspective in the sense that I'm going to argue the virgin birth of Christ or something. What I'm looking at it is from a praxis standpoint. How did God originally intend for people to live? Well, he expected them to respect human dignity. He placed us in community. And what I'm finding is when I talk with people, these resonate across cultures. So her picture is a great picture. And when I'm teaching in a classroom, the Genesis 3 side, when you look at it, that's the side after the fall. Now you have to have redemption. So when I talk to students, when I ask them about faith integration at work, they say, I'm sorry, I can't do that. I can't have a Bible study. I can't put a poster up. I can't proselytize at work. And they see the door closed to them. And I smile and say, well, what about the whole idea of justice? What about the concept of caring for the marginalized? What about stewardship? Can you practice these things at work? Can you ensure that these things happen in your business? They said, absolutely, we want that. I said, well, guess what? That comes from a biblical worldview. And they sit back and they say, I never knew. So they begin to explore it a little more. So at this conference, what I did was combine secular and faith-based approaches to character. And what I found was this. Both are robust in the way that they're presented, but I found that particularly faith-based approaches surpassed how other systems viewed character development. Not only did we cover what they were interested in, so when you up here at Kyle, Josephson, and Cabello, you see what they're zeroing in on in terms of major issues of character. Some are pretty sparse in their listings. Larry Spears, his 11 aspects of servant leadership can be boiled down to these particular areas. So what I did is went through and say, okay, look at A here. Accountability lines up with accountability over here. So I published 3 different papers looking at moral leadership servant leadership, and leadership in at-risk communities. And from those, pulled together a beginning list of a biblical worldview: respect for human dignity, godly character, responsibility, community, compassion, stewardship, care for the marginalized, use of power, justice, love of truth. Now, when I teach these in a business framework, I can associate these with specific kinds of activities that take place in a business environment. Even how you structure your business to some degree. And what's interesting is when you look at these, Bruce Winston, in his book, Be a Leader for God's Sake, takes a look at the Beatitudes. So here you have, blessed are who? The poor in spirit, humility. Any of you read business books? Good to Great by Collins? Good to Great by Collins says what? One of the key aspects of a great leader is humility. Concern for others, mourning. Controlled discipline, meekness. Do the right thing. Hunger and thirst for righteousness. Compassionate, focused attention on priorities, being pure in heart. Notice how he's having to make a translation from biblical language into language that can be accepted into the workplace. Developing those dynamic equivalents is really important. And as you read across the list down here, you can see I've listed these down here, which are faith-based and which are not. And this is not just an exhaustive list either. So what's interesting is we worked through these. I presented this information to the IACBE Region 8 conference, and we had a follow-up of questions afterwards. And I didn't really know how they were going to receive it, because just because they're a member of the organization does not mean necessarily they're Christian. And they set aside about 10 minutes for questions afterwards. Things began to be so rich, and the discussion continued to grow so much that they extended it to 45 minutes of questions and answers afterwards. And the organizers were excited that within an accreditation body, they were beginning to really wrestle with the idea of integrating faith in the way that they approach the idea of making people employable. Because what it comes down to is this. Whenever you expect the leader to show soft skills, motivating people, caring for people, those things move through the leader's heart more than they move through the leader's head. And that development of character really is the heart, I think, of employability. And we as educators who integrate faith not only as a class on ethics, but integrate it into the way we even think of business, and then how we handle people within the business and within the community, really transforms not only how we teach, but how we practice business. So I'll pause there, and I'm sure you have questions. I'll place these papers over here.
Quick question. Hi, I'm Candy. How did you choose the non-faith-based texts to do the analysis for the taxonomy, which is beautiful, by the way?
In other words, where did I find the resources?
Or I studied leadership also. I mean, there's so many that you could have gone to. How did you narrow that?
Well, the filter I used was this. I linked it to criticisms of MBA programs and the outcomes of those programs, so that I was getting from the market something they saw as lacking.